My sermon passage is Ruth chapter 4, verses 1 to 6. And I hope y'all are ready for a different approach again. Rather than read the passage, then preach, I'm going to review the story from start to finish, then zero in on chapter 4, verses 1 to 6. Once upon a time, Naomi, a Judean living in Moab, finds herself and her two daughters-in-law widowed, stranded without support in that despised foreign country, where Naomi and her dead husband Elimelech had fled from a famine around Bethlehem. She and one of the younger women, Ruth, a Moabite, returned to Bethlehem upon hearing of a break in the famine. But Ruth is still reduced to finding sustenance for them both by gathering grain left in fields, especially for the poor and the alien. Ruth meets Boaz, a wealthy grain-growing relative of Naomi's. Naomi takes a chance and shrewdly sends Ruth to his threshing floor, a risque move, in hopes of marriage and protection, rights and obligations that Boaz, as next of kin, could be expected to meet. Boaz, at first startled, is elated when Ruth bravely or desperately all but proposes marriage, but then demurs, informing her that a closer kinsman has first right and first obligation. Soon, though, Boaz almost immediately goes to the city gate, which was probably an easy walk from the threshing floor. He apparently either suspects or knows that the nearer kinsman, who's not named in the story, would pass by. Seeing him approaching, Boaz convenes elders and witnesses for an ad hoc but formal hearing. Boaz announces that Naomi has a grain field to which the nearer kinsman has a right, and the kinsman at first claims it, but then he backs out after Boaz informs him that to acquire the field, to redeem the field, he must also, for reasons not really explained, acquire Ruth. Boaz, as the nearest kinsman, the next of kin, then lays claim to the field and to Ruth with the approval of the witnesses. God blesses Boaz and Ruth with a baby boy. The women of the city declare the baby to be Naomi's son, which somehow restores her rights to the land, and the baby becomes the grandson of King David. And now the passage, Ruth 4, 1 to 6. The Bible I have has the chapter heading as the marriage of Boaz and Ruth. Well, today I'm going to call it a real estate deal. And Boaz went up to the gate and sat down there, and behold, the next of kin of whom Boaz had spoken came by. So Boaz said, "Turn aside, friend, and sit down here." And he turned aside and sat down. And Boaz took 10 men of the elders of the city and said, "Sit down here." So they sat down. Then he said to the next of kin, "Naomi, who has come back from the country of Moab, is selling the parcel of land which belonged to our kinsman Elimelech. So I thought I would tell you of it and say, buy it in the presence of those sitting here, and in the presence of the elders of my people. If you will redeem it, redeem it. But if you will not, tell me that I may know. For there is no one besides you to redeem it, and I come after you." And the man said, "I will redeem it." Then Boaz said, "The day you buy the field from the hand of Naomi, you are also buying Ruth the Moabite, the widow of the dead, in order to restore the name of the dead to his inheritance." Then the next of kin said, "I cannot redeem it for myself, lest I impair my own inheritance. Take my right of redemption yourself, for I cannot redeem it." The word of the Lord. Thanks be to God. May God grant us wisdom and courage for interpretation. God seems all but absent in the book of Ruth. God steps into the story and acts overtly just once when it says the Lord made Ruth conceive Obed, the baby boy who would become King David's grandfather. Not that the Lord wasn't on everybody's mind and heart and lips. Naomi credits the Lord with breaking the famine, prays that God grant Orpah and Ruth husbands, homes, and security, complains that the Lord has turned against her. And yet Naomi asks the Lord to bless Boaz for the good he did toward Ruth in letting her gather grain in his fields. Boaz offers the men working in his field a cheerful greeting and blessing in the name of the Lord, and they reply in kind. and he expresses wishes for the Lord to repay Ruth for her loyalty to Naomi. The elders and other witnesses at the Bethlehem city gate invoked the Lord in their prayer for good fortune and children for Ruth and Boaz. And finally, the women praised the Lord for providing for Naomi in her old age with next of kin to redeem her field in Boaz. Even Ruth is from Moab, where they worship another god, and a pretty nasty one. Even Ruth invokes the Lord when she pledges to stay with Naomi until death and after, despite her own people being enemies of Israel. The Lord, however, despite the singular divine act of procreation, is really more of an extra in this story. But I think that it's an ongoing fundamental act of God that's the very basis for hearing the whole message of Ruth. It really is more than a love story. It may be that, but it really is a kind of a real estate story. It comes down to land. It comes down to Naomi's field. And it goes back to Abram, who became Abraham. And so it starts out actually well before Ruth chapter 1, verse 1. In the story, unseen and quiet, the Lord is safeguarding the main physical element of God's promise to the people, at least for Naomi and the heirs of Elimelech. The main thing God promised the people, starting way back with Abraham, was the land itself. Land on which grows grain, from which bread is made, through which life itself is sustained. God maintains the people on the land, or helps them get back to it. And that is the underlying and ongoing divine action in the book of Ruth, across the Old Testament, actually. From the tension in Naomi and Ruth's poverty, to the scheming, to the resolution and beyond, to the family tree of King David, it all comes down to a wheat field, or it might have been barley. They were growing both. The book of Ruth is a short story. It's got distinct characters, dialogue, action, plot, settings, and scenes that unfold from start to finish, which in this case is a finale. The story turns in Ruth 4, 1 to 12, from emptiness to fullness, from abandonment to redemption. A narrator guides us as readers through selected details, including some surprises, but with much left to our imagination. The book of Ruth is seen as world literature. It's seen as theological historiography. Somebody called it a legal homily by a preacher who had the genius to do a sermon as a story. A scholar called it legal fiction. One praised Ruth as a carefully constructed drama by a writer of great literary talent who causes the emotions of the reader to fluctuate between hope and despair till the very end, when what began with multiple tragedies comes to a triumphant and happy conclusion. Yeah. Naomi, Ruth, and Boaz, the city elders, and other men and women at the scene of the city gate, they are seen as models of chesed. Remember that Hebrew word that's hard to get across in English, chesed. We try it with words like love, loyalty, mercy, kindness, steadfast love, loving kindness. Other people, though, see that the people in the story are less than ideal. Ruth does have some self-interest. Boaz has self-interest. And did Naomi exploit Ruth? Maybe. God's people, even when faithful, are faulty. But the story is soaked in chesed. A scholar by the name of Thomas Mann summarizes the heart of the story, if we see it as a model of chesed. He wrote, Ruth provides an all too brief moment in which we see the community of Israel as it could be if kindness were in its heart. Furthermore, here, family integrity is not merely a personal value, but part of the larger story of a covenant community. The family rooted in chesed builds up that community in extraordinary ways that transcend their own ordinary lives in ways that they may never know. A good family contributes to the common good, just as a severely dysfunctional families may do the reverse. For all the ambivalence and ambiguity, the book of Ruth presents two remarkable women who are part of our spiritual inheritance as well. Yes, and it all rests on land, and the story turns from loss to resolution, from emptiness to fullness, on one plot, Naomi's field. Sex and class come into play. Boaz uses his power as a man of wealth and influence with kindness and shrewdness in a way that provides for himself and Naomi and Ruth. Naomi and Ruth are socially powerless, widowed, childless. Israel at large is a beneficiary of the decisions made in the tiny person of Obed, who will be King David's grandfather. 3 legal customs are at play: inheritance, redemption, and the remarriage of a childless widow. Redemption and marriage are the most important to the story, but the custom of inheritance, which gives fuller meaning to redemption, that custom is assumed, but it's not spelled out. First, redemption. At the city gate complex, now remember that's a social space, a place of assembly for the administration of justice, for hearings, and for resolution of public questions and matters. So at the city gate complex is where redemption takes place. And the book of Ruth mentions redemption 23 times, with most of them here at the city gate. Remember, to redeem is to buy back, or to rescue, to ransom, or to liberate. Leviticus 25 outlined the obligation that a close male relative had to buy back land, or to buy back a person lost to a household or an extended family, perhaps by debt. People were taking the custody for debt. Second, Deuteronomy 25 explains the law that makes it the duty of a dead husband's brother. Let me say that slower. Deuteronomy 25 explains the law that makes it the duty of a dead husband's brother to marry the widow and produce a son in the dead man's name. Spelled out. So Boaz is a redeemer, both by acquiring Naomi's field and by marrying Ruth, the widow of a deceased relative, in order to produce descendants for him. Redemption and that kind of marriage both rest on the inheritance tradition. Inheritance involves properties and legal rights that fall to heirs when an owner dies, and it's related to marriage, in that it demanded that a wife produce an heir for the head male or husband, which would eventually be transferred to a son. Land belonged to the family, and inheritance rights extended to the extended family. Now, there are a lot of unknowns here, not only about how these legal traditions were understood 2,500 to 3,500 years ago, but about how whoever wrote Ruth wanted them to be understood in this story. On the threshing floor, a scene that sets up the action at the city gate, did Ruth propose marriage thinking a land redeemer also had some marriage obligation? Or was the redeemer tradition broad enough to include that? Don't know. How did Naomi own a field or have the right to it, since there was no known right of a widow to inherit? Don't know. The Elimelech family was absent from Judah for at least a decade, according to the story. They were in Moab, and productive farmland would have been scarce during a famine. So did somebody else assume de facto ownership of Naomi's field or of Elimelech's field when they were away in Moab? Or did Elimelech leave it with a trustee? Is that why it was redeemable and somehow belonged to Naomi? Don't know. On what basis did Boaz link redemption of the field to marrying Ruth? And why was the other kinsman surprised to learn at the last minute that Ruth would come with the land, causing him to back out of the deal? And what about the sandal ceremony? Did the first readers need that explanation of how things were done long before, or was it for a literary effect? Well, we can let some of the questions hang out there, because it's a story, not a legal document, not a legal code, not a court transcript. It's a story. It's a story of hope and renewal, and that's why we love it. So I think it was supposed to be heard like a sermon story or a Sunday school lesson. Now, going back to Hesed, such extraordinary kindness and loyalty would have stood out to the first readers or hearers of Ruth just as they do to us. They also would have realized that the backdrop to the story was couched in covenants among people and between the people and God. And if they didn't understand that at first, they surely did at the first mention of Naomi's field. I can imagine people reading or listening to that point and going, so that's what this is all about. The surprise revelation reoriented a story that had been a dramatic, if not shocking, love story. A man of God was about to marry a woman from Moab, a heathen foreigner. And then suddenly, there's a wheat field and inheritance is at play. Naomi's field is an anchor of this story, twisting the plot, giving a reminder that God had been present and at work all along, holding up God's end of the covenant with God's people. This is covenant theology. For the people of Israel, land was the promised land, the physical manifestation and foundation of their covenant with God. The people first hearing or reading the book of Ruth would have been taught that from the very start of their history as a people, God had big plans, bigger than any one family. Big plans for the land promised to Abraham's distant descendants way back in Genesis 15. Abraham's relationship to the land was tied to a much larger divine purpose than his own personal life. In the connection of Elimelech and Naomi and Boaz and even the foreigner Ruth, their connection to the land has a much larger divine purpose than their own personal lives. And it's not just because of David and his baby future grandfather. The theology of land starts with the promise, and Israel's own land history starts with the land of Canaan, which God gave to Israel, the Bible says, after some 400 years of slavery in Egypt. God gave them Canaan in fulfillment of the promise. And Israel was never supposed to forget that the people didn't actually own land. It was an inheritance from God. Walter Brueggemann, a poet and scholar of the Old Testament, who I quote often reading his poems, has such insight. Walter Brueggemann says, "The fundamental dream of Israel is about land. Israel is a social theological experiment in alternative land management. The God of Israel is a God who gives land, and Israel is a people that holds land in alternative ways, intended to promote an alternative to the imperial system of land, both in the Egyptian Empire and among the powers that they encountered when they first arrived in Canaan. It's an anti-empire thing. It's an anti-empire thing. The theology of the land of the promise and the theology of the promised land, rather, is at the bottom of the story. Ruth, Naomi, and Boaz, they're not puppets, though. They act in extraordinary ways that transcend their own ordinary lives. And more specifically, they act out covenant life within a particular situation, within a social structure that aims to uphold social justice and righteousness. And people think, here's an aside, I shouldn't do this, people think social justice is a new idea for people of faith. People need to read their Bibles. Ancient Israel's history is a story of faithfulness to God and security in the land on one hand, and unfaithfulness threatening that security on the other. It plays out in the books of Joshua, Judges, 1st and 2nd Samuel, 1st and 2nd Kings, some of the prophets, and in Ruth. The book of Ruth is a snapshot. Naomi's field is the thing. Maybe it's not spelled out because it was so understood 2,500 years ago or 3,000 years ago that it went without saying. Boaz acts faithfully to secure the field, to redeem it for Naomi's family. Hidden in the story or not, the living God acts as God had acted since the covenant with Abraham, as the living God acts in our lives to maintain the new covenants. A covenant, like a marriage or any deep relationship, requires mutual commitment, mutual commitment on our part and on God's part. So here's a big lesson from the book of Ruth. God is always at work helping hold us together as God's people, whether or not we're quiet, still, or humble enough to notice. Thanks be to God. Amen.